I'm Brendan Folkowski. I'm the founder of Gravity Department, which is a small web strategy and design studio in Pennsylvania. My work's split about 50-50 between client services for companies like Skinny Ties and now Angry Birds, and product work, things like Acumen, which is a front-end theme for Magento, and I'm building a responsive design toolkit for Magento Enterprise. I'm also a member of Magento's advisory board for developer certification, and I took the front-end cert the other day and passed it, so good job. And most of my work these days is multi-device in nature. Oh, I got to do two hands. Sorry about that. There, you can see all that stuff. This talk is part 2. I did part 1 last year, right here. And in 230 slides, I covered why mobile matters, small screen methodologies, what you can build, best practices for mobile-first responsive design, and how to define and execute a strategy for you or for your clients. And if you haven't seen it, you can watch it on my site. All the notes are there, so you don't miss any of the content. But I'm not going to rehash anything today, because part 2 is all about what I learned from responsive e-commerce in the last year and how you can springboard from that. So let's look at the state of mobile devices and e-commerce in 2013. In the US and Europe, e-commerce revenue is about $370 billion in 2012. And it's projected to reach $439 billion in 2014. But if you look at the subset of just mobile revenue, which is this red area here, we see it's driving the vast majority of growth over the next few years. And 2 years ago, it was only 2% of e-commerce. And 2 years from now, mobile is going to represent 23%. So if we look at the devices that are owned by US adults today, 31% of them have a tablet, and that's up from just 12% last year. 87% have a cell phone, and 45% own a smartphone. And that's now over half of all phones. And for 17% of cell phone owners, that's their primary access to the web. They don't have a computer or a tablet, no other devices. That's the only way they get information. So in certain demographics, 40 to 50% rely on their phone for web access. And when mobile devices aren't a second screen, that measures up a pretty significant portion of your user base. And since it's the only screen, your web strategy has to reflect that. Since last year, responsive design has started to take foot in e-commerce. We're still in the early stages of figuring it out, but the indications are really promising. So does this sound familiar to you? If our design was more modern, we'd have better sales. Or making our site mobile-friendly would be huge. I see that a lot, and companies think in design and technology problems. And those things are great because they're surface level and everyone can see value in them. But especially in responsive e-commerce projects, they act like blinders that hide these deep-rooted problems in your content. Responsive design is not all the devices and prettiness. That's the seduction of it that everyone likes to focus on. But the reality is responsive design is planning for your content to go everywhere. And content audits aren't sexy, but that's where it has to start. So Skinny Ties is a client of mine. They're a small family-run company. They operate in a really narrow and competitive niche. And I worked with them for about 8 months to reimagine their business and design strategies. And responsive design was at the core of that. And what they had were not mobile problems necessarily, but they had content problems. Aesthetically, it was a big step forward, and we kind of had to go back to basics before we could really do the project we needed to. So we studied how users shopped for ties, and we saw they looked for black ties or silk ties or 1.5-inch ties with stripes. And when we connected that with what our primary navigation was at the time, it was obviously just single-faceted, and it wasn't helping them. So every specification that we could relate from a tie, like width, color, fabric, pattern, all that was documented across the entire catalog, and then we kind of found it was a mess. There were 8 different ways to describe green. There were 5 different ways to write a width. And when we used that research, we modeled a new product data schema that was descriptive, consistent, and keyword infused. And if that sounds a lot like search engine optimization, it should, because making refined, multi-dimensional content is a great SEO benefit. And since Google prefers responsive design, this is a win-win for them in more ways than one. Now, we all know that good photography sells, but their first incarnation was limited to the boxes that were sort of imposed by their CMS. And their photo asset production was based around filling those boxes rather than showing off their products in the best light. So in the new site, we made consistent, bold photography central to their whole content strategy. And we tightly controlled the composition by creating style guides for every aspect of the photography experience, like the angularity of the light, the orientation, the scale. So when you look at all the ties, it doesn't matter which one you're looking at, they all look like they're just morphed into a new color or style. And the results are really stunning, especially if you pull it up on an HD tablet. But discoverability and photography only go so far. You still need to build trust. And skinny ties, for them, that meant demonstrating expertise. It's not enough to simply list the product specs on the site. We needed to interpret them so we could help customers make style and practical purchases. So we answered questions like, how skinny should you go with a tie? What's the right fabric for winter? Is it long enough for me? And what's the right knot to use for this width? And how do I tie that? Now, that knowledge is associated with their products and brand, but without that meaningful content, the most beautiful design would still lack credibility. So the point here is that responsive design as a technology is not the silver bullet. If we hadn't stepped back to rethink assumptions about skinny ties content, all those problems would be endemic across all the devices that responsive design serves. So having considered those issues, we created this framework of needs and goals to approach the aesthetic and technological challenges that skinny ties was facing. And when we started designing responsively, our content-first approach led to success. Now, when Net Magazine picked the top 25 responsive sites from 2012, there were some really large brands on the list, and skinny ties was on there for a good reason. Responsive design is often criticized for having as much, if not more, bulk to it than a desktop site. And Jonathan Snook wrote a great summary of why sites are slow today. This image is the perfect visualization of what's happening with web performance today. If content is the battle, then performance is certainly the war that we're fighting. Designers need to acknowledge that every addition of content is a subtraction of performance and possibly a negative impact on user experience. And there's this perpetual myth that faster browsers and better networks have beaten the performance problem. But the fact is that delivery technologies are getting faster, but the weight we're cramming into websites is more than outpacing those gains. So among sites in the Alexa Retail 2000, the median load time is up 22% since last year. And it'll be over 9 seconds by this holiday season. The business case needs to be made for performance. We have to quantify how much it hurts, and that's what we use to make change. Walmart's taking a look at this in a really humble way. 8 of their 10 biggest competitors are faster than them. And after putting a performance analyst and a business analyst together, here's what they found. This graph shows Walmart's conversion rate versus page load time. The blue bars show the percentage of users experiencing different load times, and the red line is their conversion rate. So what do you see when you look at that? There's a really sharp conversion decline from 0 to 3 seconds, and a 4-second load converts almost as well as a 14-second load, which is pretty terrible. And the majority of users are in this flat, low conversion tail. And when they put business metrics on top of that data, they found some really incentivizing results. So how do we improve performance? You should ignore the back end. And that's going to sound crazy if you've been to any Magento performance talk in the last 3 years. They usually champion things like tuning the server, full-page caching, and all these acronyms and buzzwords that I don't understand because I'm a front-end guy. And that's really great advice for scalability, and there's a good business reason to have those things, but that's only solving a fraction of the performance problem. Steve Souders literally wrote the book on high-performance websites. Oh, sorry. And he used to lead performance engineering for Yahoo, and now he's been at Google for a few years doing the same thing. And when he scanned 50,000 sites, they found that 13% of load time comes from the back end, but 87% is from the front end. So this sort of became known as the performance golden rule. Your front end makes users wait 4 times longer than your back end does. So that's where you want to put your resources in optimization. It almost doesn't matter how good your back end is. A sloppy front end will easily undermine all your back end efforts. So your front end needs a steward. They're responsible for managing the business versus performance needs and holding the fort. If you add something, you have to stay honest and then take something away or find a smarter way to optimize both of them. So how do we measure performance? There are 3 excellent tools for generating a performance score, YSlow, Google PageSpeed, and Web Page Test. And they evaluate dozens of metrics, and they give you a number. But if you need to dig in and figure out which things specifically are slowing you down, you can use waterfall graphs in browsers, tools like Web Inspector or Firebug. And they're invaluable when you're trying to isolate a specific problem. But these are not easy to generate on some mobile devices that lack profiling tools. You can kind of hack around them, and I have a link there because it's too complicated to explain. And keep in mind, there's a real difference between measured speed and perceived speed. A page that starts rendering first but actually takes longer to load will feel faster to the user. So what your brain sees and what's actually happening can be totally different. The good news is you can improve front-end speed significantly with a lot of very small and relatively simple tweaks. First off, you want to reduce HTTP requests. So things like icons, you want to combine them into sprites, and you want to bundle dependent scripts together. Tell the browser to perform a DNS lookup for external assets before they're encountered in the page. You want to prevent cookies from being sent on non-dynamic requests, so all static assets. Modern browsers will download multiple things in parallel. So if you use multiple domains, you can get 2 from here and 2 from here. That speeds things up. When a browser sees a script tag, it actually waits until that entire asset downloads before it proceeds. So if you put them up in the head, you're going to block everything that renders visually on your page from starting. And you can use the async attribute to tell modern browsers that they don't have to wait for that asset if it does have to be in the head. For example, the prototype that's in Magento. And then it'll keep loading the page. The browser won't start rendering all CSS until all CSS is downloaded and parsed. So you only want to have one file, and you want that to be the first thing that hits the content stream in the browser. And this one breaks tips number 3 and 4. The page will render faster if you load the CSS from your site domain instead of using a CDN or another external domain. And that's good because you don't have the DNS request for it, and you don't have the HTTP request of going off to another server. CDNs will duplicate your content around the world so it's physically closer to your users, and that reduces latency in all of your requests. Minifying your code removes comments and white space, and that makes them smaller and faster to load. If you turn on gzip compression on the server, it'll crunch files up to about 70% before transmitting them. And using the right image format and bit depth for images can save a huge amount. Varying the compression is sort of a balancing act. You have to decide if quality is more important or speed is more important. It's not something you can just apply globally, like a set it and forget it fix. And this prevents browsers from re-downloading content that hasn't changed. There's a really good link there. Steve Souders gives a talk called Cache is King that sort of demystifies how big a problem this is for even the biggest sites on the planet. And you want to postpone delivering heavy assets like images and scripts until the moment the user actually needs them. So there's a few extra resources as well. If you've been building for the desktop or separately for mobile, the best practices can be pretty hard fought. And I'm going to run through some specific things to eCommerce and Magento that snagged me that I hope I can help you avoid. Markup is the weakest link in responsive web design. Magento is an extremely powerful platform, but it's designed to be desktop-centric. So there are some practices you need to undo and patterns you might want to rewrite to be more adaptable to a mobile-first development process. For example, Magento ships with 4 page templates, but column layouts are inherently non-semantic, and they infer decisions about where content belongs relative to this desktop-centric viewport. But what happens if the left and right sidebars swap positions, and then one appears above the main content or both of them appear below it when you're on a small screen? Because markup order matters when you're reflowing containers, you don't have the flexibility needed when you're working with these generic columnar layouts. And that's why the only page template that I find really useful for responsive design is one column, which is essentially no columns. It makes no assumptions about the content, and I can derive the exact markup and proportions that the content demands. And this might seem odd because they have the same columnar groupings, like left and main, but having a specific template file for each scenario that your content needs lets you bind the markup and CSS to that module directly and most appropriately. Then you don't have to rewrite the XML references across multiple modules, and you can simply move the getChildHTML calls to wherever you need that piece of content to render, whether it's left, right, center, whatever makes sense. As you're designing each section, you can define the proportions and breakpoints that make sense for catalog lists and layer navigation separately from something that uses a 2-column layout like the checkout steps and the progress indicator. And you can't do that if you use generic containers easily. So CSS3 Flexbox is coming. It's a really powerful feature that's going to wipe away some of those issues with reordering content. But it's not very well supported yet, and there's some links there if you want to read more about it. Handling images is one of the most ambiguous challenges facing multi-device design right now. And what we need from the browser is for it to automatically request the most appropriate asset depending on if the screen is small or big, what's the density of it, and what's the network's quality. And none of that's possible today, but we can get close. So first, image replacement. This is like you load the smallest asset on all devices, and then you use JavaScript to check if the device is large and has a high DPI screen, and then you replace the image so it actually loads too. Now the pros with this is that it's lightweight initially. It's a true mobile-first solution. And the cons is you're more than doubling your bandwidth sent to users on bigger screens. You can oversize. This is where you load the high DPI asset first, so it might be at 2x or at 1.5x, and then you let the browser scale it down. The good thing here is there's no double download penalty, and high DPI tablets and external displays are coming. That's going to be the norm soon. The downsides are it hurts users on slow connections, and if you don't have a retina screen, you're downloading something much bigger than your user will actually use. And you can sort of get away with 1.5x right now. That's what I like to do in this case. You serve that instead as a middle ground, and it looks decent when it's scaled up on high DPI screens, but it's not so big that it's a detriment to users who don't have them. The other way you can do it is supersizing. So you might send an image 5 times bigger than any user will actually see, but you compress it at a really low quality, like 25%. And when the browser does that scaling, all the artifacts that appear from an algorithm like JPEG, they sort of disappear and are invisible. And you can get dramatically smaller file sizes than if you might have served the 1.5x or 2x asset in the first place. The downside there is if you send a really big image and then you ask the browser to scale it, it has to do that work. So a low-powered device might have a slight performance delay doing that. Picture fill is a JS polyfill for the proposed picture element. This is something that might be coming into HTML, but it's sort of not standardized yet. What's good about this is it lets you have full control over asset loading, but it requires JS. But there's a no script fallback, so if that's not active or it doesn't parse properly, you still have a mobile-first small image something in place. The downside is that this and the source set syntax are pretty complicated, so you probably can't do this for images you write in blog posts or maintain every day. But if you can code it into the templates like the catalog view or the product view, it's a good way to make sure the right asset goes to the right device at all times. And lastly, Sencha is a URL tool, so you can create multiple assets. Creating multiple assets by hand is impractical if you have to have someone resize and reshape them and upload them. So you need a web service like this that accepts an image in the URL, and it takes parameters. It'll resize them automatically, cache them, and then serve those assets out on the fly. Magento has a method like this built in, but it's only useful for assets that are in the file system, which is, for the most part, product images. But in the other case, you still need to detect which asset is appropriate before requesting it. So something like picture fill is still a necessity. Jason Grigsby came up with 8 guidelines and 1 rule for a dream scenario of responsive images. And I want to share the rule because it's really smart. You want to plan for the fact that whatever you're doing today, it's going to be deprecated. In a year, the best way you can do it is going to change. So this reminds us that we're still sort of figuring all this stuff out. For example, there's still no reliable way to detect bandwidth or latency. And even if you could, that might change mid-request. So some users might not want high DPI assets, even if their device is capable of displaying them. For example, if they pay per megabyte. And a smarter configuration might be offering the option to enable high DPI assets. So if you tap the image, you can switch in the better quality. Now, there isn't a silver bullet for responsive images. It has to be this balancing act between the device capabilities, your quality standards, and all the other pieces of your infrastructure that affect performance. And for skinny ties, we handled this in 3 different ways. Sometimes we just send the 1x image, which is fine. For small things that are low priority, it's OK to do that. There are really only a few instances where we did it. And then things like icons are always combined into a sprite and made into 2 sheets with the appropriate pixel densities. A lot of people are experimenting with things like SVG, which can be a little bit faster to load. There are some drawbacks to that, or fonts for browsers that don't render them so cleanly. It might make your site look uglier. So in this case, we still chose to go with image sprites because it gives us the best user experience. The majority of images on skinny ties are loaded at 1.5x. This includes everything from the navigation thumbnails to the featured content on the home pages and everything in catalog lists. This increase in bandwidth is actually really small for us because the art direction we have with the ties isolated on white plays really well into JPEG's compression algorithm. So we don't really have to overthink how images are going to scale, and it always ensures that they always look decent on different devices. But on product pages, we do something a little different. We serve the 1x asset to all devices first. And this is effectively a 2x asset on a phone. So it's just scaling itself. And then we don't have a double download there. So if we detect the screen size is large and high DPI, then we replace that asset with the 2x version. And right now, that means mostly just iPads. And that looks good, because even if you take that 1.5x asset and scale it, or if you try to take that 2x asset and zoom it on an iPad, even though we don't have a 4x asset to give you more resolution, you can still use that same logic that a 1.5x will scale to 2 and look good. So you can zoom in about 50% without any perceptible loss in quality. And that gets around having to build all these complicated JavaScript lightboxes that can't pan and zoom on a tablet, because you're panning and zooming. They account for browser interactions. And again, so all the sprite icons in the site are combined into 1x and 2x pixel densities. The stretching effect that high DPI displays is most pronounced on line art, like icons. So on small screens where we're using them, in lieu of navigation, it's kind of important to make sure they look sharp and extra clear. So for every project, this approach is going to have to play out differently. It's most important to optimize for your content and less important to try to build a blanket approach that'll work everywhere, because you'll actually deliver worse performance by doing that. So Sass and Compass are essential tools for writing maintainable multi-device CSS today. I don't really know anyone who writes vanilla CSS anymore. If you're still in that group, you should really check them out. Sass is a preprocessor for CSS that extends the language's capabilities with variables, functions, mixins, and placeholders, sort of like in a programming language. And Compass is a library that sits on top of Sass and adds hundreds of useful mixins and functions for everything like color blending to sprite generation. So you don't have to do that manually in a graphics editor. The basics are really easy to learn, but this can have a tremendous impact on how extensible, maintainable, and effective your CSS is. For a complex responsive project, not using preprocessed CSS would be a deal breaker. You can compile them from the command line, and most teams integrate into a build process like Grunt. If you're working locally or solo, then apps like CodeKit, Hammer, or Scout can be really useful. I like to use CodeKit when I'm working on stuff alone. It's a really good tool. And architecting a design system with Sass is a whole topic onto itself. I don't have time to delve into it today. So here are two screenshots from a typical project folder of mine, and you can inspect this later. One's the associated loader of all the Sass partials, and the one on the right shows you, or the one on the left shows you how all those things are organized as a file system. I have to mention frameworks like Bootstrap or Zurb Foundation because I know somebody will definitely ask about them. These are supersized pattern libraries with extensive documentation, and the purpose of them is to rapidly prototype new interfaces for design testing, and for that, they're really, really good. And a blank slate app could take that and turn it into production code, but Magento has its own deep-rooted patterns and front-end practices. So if you ignore them and went and replaced them all with a framework, that would create a lot of redundancy and bloat. And it will also create compatibility issues with extensions. So that's not a great approach. It's a lot smarter to borrow ideas from them and take out the snippets from those frameworks that you like and will use, and then integrate them in your own little pattern library for each project. You'll have fewer dependencies and less to maintain in the long run. And this is how I've been working lately. It makes a lot of sense. Dave Rupert from Paravel calls these mini bootstraps. And he's suggesting this is the modern design deliverable for responsive design. Instead of handing off Photoshop comps that are fully realized to clients, you want to get them looking at things on devices and on browsers as soon as possible. I tend to agree that works. Media queries are part of the CSS spec, but sometimes you need to change the JS behavior that you're also doing in response to media queries. So newer browsers support the window.matchMedia object to detect if a media query is active via JavaScript. And this is great for one-off cases, but usually you need something a little bit more powerful. So at different breakpoints, your front end might have to set up, register, or deregister JS code to prevent these events from overlapping. Harvey and Enquire are two state managers for media queries that listen for viewport changes, and then they fire these setup deregister callbacks. And this prevents devices from executing code that doesn't apply to them, and it helps coordinate application logic separately from, or in parallel with your layout. Multi-device events can be used to make web interfaces feel more like native apps, but they can be tricky to work with. They fire independently of one another with three basic events: touch start, touch move, and touch end. And there's 5 of them, so if you have a bunch of fingers moving, they're all going simultaneously. And after the touch start event, most browsers will put in a 300 millisecond delay. And the purpose of this is to detect if you're doing a double tap or a long tap, which aren't really used too often on the web. but the downside is that makes your interface feel slow and unattentive. So you could get around this by triggering an action with touch start and preventing the event from bubbling up, but then you'd inadvertently trigger the event if the user touches a button and tries to swipe from it. So a better option is actually using the touch end event and measuring whether the touch position changes between the start and finish. That way you can rule out whether the user's trying to scroll. But the simplest way is using a small library to detect taps, and there's a whole bunch of them. But some Android versions will randomly drop the touch end events. Sometimes they'll stop firing the finishing events for something if another touch event starts. So this can get really hard to debug, and that's why you really need to test this on devices. You can't use emulators for that. Depending on the interactions you're trying to build and the devices you need to support, you may not be able to harness them reliably, so you might have to use quick events as a fallback. There's a few extra resources reading about that. When I implement responsive forms, there are two patterns that I use. One I call stack forms. They're completely linear. The labels are above the inputs, and below that are contextual notes or errors. And this pattern works really well on small screens where you can't see more than one input at a time because of the on-screen keyboard. The other thing is scaffold forms. In this one, you're placing the label and the input adjacent to one another. This can make larger forms feel a little bit more compact, and grouping field sets with headings also helps break up the forms to make them more digestible. And when there isn't enough horizontal space, scaffold forms just collapse and turn into stack forms. This is sort of the adaptation that you'll work in. But I never put two inputs adjacent to one another. By default, Magento does this in the billing and shipping address forms, but it's inefficient and it's confusing to the eye because you have to crisscross between all these elements in a non-logical way. It's always a usability plus to design a forms flow consistently and sequentially. So this is a great example of how designing for mobile first helps you prevent overcomplicating the larger screen experience. HTML5 input types can help mobile users complete forms significantly faster by changing their on-screen keyboard to use just the controls for whatever data you're trying to capture. If you use the email type, it'll add the @ symbols to the alphabetic keyboard. Telephone type will swap out the key dialog keypad. But usually you don't want users entering a hash or a star symbol in something like a credit card field. So we don't actually use those too often. You might try using the number type, but that brings up the correct numeric keypad. But some browsers like Chrome are starting to render little custom controls, which are right now too tiny to really be useful. And this can be confusing to users for values that shouldn't or wouldn't ever be incremented, like their phone number or their credit card number. So instead, when I'm trying to input numbers, I use regular old text inputs with the pattern attribute. And this will prompt the on-screen keyboards to use the numeric keypad without the hash signs. And it makes entering things like credit cards much easier on phones. And on the desktop, it behaves just like a normal text input. But providing incrementation controls isn't a bad idea, because that can make it easier for things like quantity to just tap up or down. And if you make the button targets larger, you should implement a UI pattern so it's easy for users to increment, decrement, or manually adjust things like their quantity. Those things help users complete forms faster, but if you leave checkout and re-enter it later, all your input is going to be lost. So Sisyphus is a JS component that monitors forms, and it saves any unsubmitted data in HTML5's local storage. Then when you return to that form later, it pre-fills all that data back in, so you don't have to type it all in. You can pick up right where you left off. And this can save a lot of time on mobile devices where it takes the longest to type in information. Tables and responsive design are like oil and water. There isn't an easy way to view a large granular data set on a really small screen. So thankfully, in e-commerce, tables are limited to a few scenarios that we can manage. These are a few of the patterns that I use depending on the context. First, don't assume that tables were the right choice in the first place. For example, the catalog lists in grid mode shouldn't be a table because the markup can't adapt or reflow for the number of items that you need to fit in different viewports. It's a better idea to rewrite that as an ordered list and use nth child to define the number of items per row and when clears and line breaks should occur. This gives you a lot more freedom and none of the headaches of working with the original table code. Simple tables sometimes don't need any special transformations. If they have between 2 and 4 columns, you might be able to just compress them down, and they'll work fine on small screens if the content wraps around nicely. But for some tables, there's too much data to do that. So they can't simply be scaled down without changing either the content or changing the structure. Priority tables are also 100% flexible, but instead you add and drop columns for different viewports. So this pattern is only recommended, I think, for things like summaries. You shouldn't remove access to useful content. But for example, if you had an order history table, you can most likely identify what you're looking for by the order number or the date or the price. You don't necessarily need to know who it was shipped to and what its pending status is. You can click through to the summary page to get the full set of information. Linearized tables basically dissolve the table structure entirely. So all the cells become block level or inline, and they might be positioned absolutely within the table row. Because you lose table headings, some data might need supplemental labels or completely different formatting to be understandable or logically ordered. But with that extra work, you can make the content much more usable. For example, separating summaries and interactions in the cart helps minimize the interface on small screens. Some tables are beyond transformation, though, and especially those that have column spans or conditional columns that might appear or might not, depending on things like tax rules. This makes changing the table structure a Herculean effort, and a lot of these edge cases come into play. So scroll tables are sort of your last resort when you just can't significantly modify the structure. This lets you render the full table with most of the content off screen, and it's accessible by scrolling back and forth, but you can only see a small portion of the table at once. So it's not the best way to do it, it's just a concession. And it's hard to visualize without really exploring around. These are by no means all the patterns for transforming tabular content. There's a link for more information, but those are the ones that are most applicable to e-commerce sites. Social widgets are on almost every site today, and they're some of the worst performance offenders. I fight really hard against implementing them because they're not designed for small screens. They have inconsistent margins. But the biggest reason is performance. If you embed them, you're going to jump up the size of your site and the number of HTTP requests significantly. And that has a pretty dramatic impact on your load times. So usually I just get rid of them. And there's a simple, fast alternative, which is links. They're not really used very often, but they're really powerful. Every social site has them. You have full control over the styling. The sharing interface that the user gets to is almost identical, and they're instantly recognizable and really tap-friendly. Good sides, there's no extra HTTP requests, and it's less than a kilobyte of data. So you're not going to hurt performance doing this at all, and you're still going to give users utility. One downside is there are no counters. So if you need to do that, there are a few scripts there that can collect that data from the networks. Third-party extensions can crush you. Even if you build the perfect, lean, responsive site, I'll bet dollars to pesos that all the third-party extensions you're using, they're not. They're built desktop first. So most stores have a significant number of partners, vendors, and integrations that add all this critical functionality. And you can't simply leave them as is. So every third-party component that you bring into your site that renders on the front end, it needs to be brought up to responsive standards. And this usually plays out in 3 ways. Either you request the vendors change their infrastructure or platform, you remove all of their styling, and then you do that yourself on the front end, or you fork the whole code base and maintain it yourself. And there seems to be this idea that checkout is really hard to do well on small screens, and I disagree with that. A good checkout flows naturally. It's not distracting because you focus on one thing at a time. And a small screen actually helps you do those things. So it's the big screens where people do stupid things. Don't worry that you need 15 inputs from a user, because people are really good at completing sequential tasks. They're not going to get flustered by that. Just don't get in their way. And you can do this by taking out unnecessary steps like fax numbers, pre-fill their data whenever you can, and use the appropriate inputs so they can type stuff in faster. The Baymard Institute and Smash Magazine are great resources for checkout best practices if you want to go read more about it. But let's break down Magento's one-page checkout. You have this accordion of the steps and then the progress on the side. But if you compress this for small screens, the progress block has nowhere to go. So you can either put it up top, where it almost immediately scrolls out of sight and out of mind, or you can put it below, where it's beyond the checkout step. So most users aren't going to actually get there before they need to review their stuff. So the easiest way to do this today is to move that progress block into the review step so they actually see it right before they make the checkout action. But there's a better thing we could do. I call it woven checkout, and it's a pretty significant modification of Magento, so you might not be able to do it. I'll explain why. Instead of bundling all the components together, we compress them, and then as you complete each step, it collapses into the place where the editing content you just worked on is completed. So then at the end, you can swipe up or swipe down, and if you need to tap on something to review, you can do that. There's a natural hierarchy. The proximity between the action you're editing and the action you're inputting is the same, so there's no gap in your mind, and it's device-friendly. This works across all the devices without any drastic layout transformations or moving blocks or content around in the markup. And if you study checkout in native apps, you see this pattern gaining a lot of traction. It's another great example of where designing for a mobile screen first helps you think smarter about the desktop site. Again, extensions. I'd love to see Magento offer one-page checkout with something more flexible like this, but it really needs to be a supported core feature, because third parties that integrate with checkout, they need a standardized architecture to extend and a callback pattern to bring in their own pieces. And that's why it can be a nightmare if you have a lot of third-party code running on the site. And that's all the tech and design stuff. It's great. I love it. That's what I work on. But it means nothing if you're not driving the business goals forward. So I spoke about this in much greater detail yesterday in the marketing track. Year over year, Skinny Ties is doing 90% more revenue than last year with a responsive site. And SEO-wise, they're yielding about 79% more targeted organic traffic. It's completely transformed the way they do business. Also, Electric Pulp did another case study for this about O'Neill clothing, and they saw really, really similar results. So I urge you to check out those links there. It's pretty interesting. I hope to hear more stories like this from you guys. Sharing this data creates a lot of opportunity, but I can't really do it alone. So it's a fantastic investment if you move your business from a position of weakness to a position of strength. And I hope to see a lot more of those kind of ideas from you guys in the future. It's a great privilege to be here, and I want to thank Magento for inviting me back again. This is my third time speaking at Imagine. I've got a lot of friends in the audience and a lot more new faces, so I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve.